Welcome back to ΣիվիլNet. I'm your host, Patrick Elliott, and I'm joined today by Bryan Ardouny, the Executive Director of the Armenian Assembly of America. Thanks, Bryan. Good to have you.
Good to be here.
So, some would say that Armenia is the Armenian community in the United States. We have advocacy, but we don't have organized, structured, proper lobbying. What would you say to that, and how do you guys differ?
Well, that's a good question to start off with. Look, there's obviously a very vibrant community in the United States that cares deeply about Armenia and Artsakh. And the Armenian Assembly was created in 1972 for that purpose, essentially, is to have a voice in Washington, D.C. on key issues of concern. And that's what we've focused on all these years, whether the earthquake in 1988, through Armenia's independence, into current day.
So, what would you say that we can be doing better to advocate? I mean, again, we have community organizations, we have cultural events, but it just seems like there isn't a united voice that's really pushing in a concerted and strategic way the interests of the Republic of Armenia.
Right. Well, you know, you raise, again, another fair point. I think part of it, what we need to do, what I think we could all do a better job of, is when we have our advocacy summits in Washington, D.C., when people come together in Washington, D.C., where policy is made, we need more and more voices coming together. When you see other lobbies that are in Washington, D.C., they have not 1,000, not 2,000, not 5,000, but 20,000 plus people coming to D.C. on an annual basis to make sure that their voices are heard, and we need to do the same. We need more and more people coming to Washington to talk about these key issues.
There definitely has been, let's say, a rapprochement between the United States and Armenia lately. Do you think that has to do with our democratic shift? Do you think it's more recent? Is it because we're very kind of openly breaking away from a Russian overlord? What's prompted this renewed interest in Armenia? I'm talking specifically about that watershed moment where Nancy Pelosi, then Speaker of the House, showed up right at the height of the battles around Jermuk.
Yes.
And
So we have worked on a nonpartisan basis, bipartisan basis, but certainly have worked with then Speaker Pelosi for many years, and we had encouraged her to come to Armenia, and we were very glad about that visit and that trip. We feel that it saved lives. We also later honored her, and she actually came to an event in Washington, D.C., over 300 people, standing ovation, and it was on the same day as the day she announced her, not retirement, but her retirement from the position of Speaker, that she was handing it over to the next generation. So that was on November 17th. So in the morning, all the news was on that, and then in the evening, she came to the Armenian community. To us, and we talked about that trip and everything. So I think it's look, the current administration has talked about the importance of defending democracies, the importance of helping democracies, and we've seen, Armenia, pivoting and transforming into a much more vibrant democracy, and also pivoting to the West. So I think it's both of those things.
I find that Armenia is lacking the branding, right? Let's talk specifically about Ukraine and Russia, which is what everyone is constantly comparing to, right? And what was interesting is that, when Nancy Pelosi showed up, when she gave her speech, she mentioned, the front line of defending democracies, and she mentioned Ukraine against Russia, China and Taiwan, and Armenia, and she didn't openly state Azerbaijan, but it was obviously implied. So, if we're being held up to that standard, why are we failing to get our point across that this is a beacon of democracy, that we are a free people who are standing up to larger authoritarian states, and why isn't Washington, as we said, they're definitely opening up to it, but why isn't it happening faster or more concretely or on a more permanent basis?
Yeah, I think we all want it to happen faster and quicker, for sure. Look, the media market is very crowded. And you're right, I think we can do a better job there too in telling that story, not just us, but here in Armenia as well. Those stories that get picked up, you're right, are few and far between. So we need to do a better job of telling that, when I say story, but explaining it and having that narrative out there more and more.
Tell me, let's be honest, we're up against four pretty powerful major lobbies, right? We're against the Turkish lobby, the Azeri lobby in DC, the oil and gas lobby in DC, and also the Israeli lobby. Do we have the resources to combat them? Do we have the ability to thwart them? Do we have the ability to get our narrative across to the right people and the decision makers that are going to lead to some real tangible benefits for Armenia itself? Yeah. How do we win is what I'm asking. Right. How do we win?
The David versus Goliath situation. And it is a tough slog sometimes going through this. And what I say often is, if we're not talking about these issues, if the community is not meeting with members of Congress and talking about these issues, who is? Sometimes the answer is, well, I don't know. But the answer is, our adversaries are talking about these issues, and they're framing it in a way that none of us would appreciate. So it's a day in, day out challenge in terms of talking about these issues. At our advocacy summit that we just held at the end of September, we had over 300 in-person meetings, and we talked about one of the key priority and messaging points that we had was holding Aliyev, the regime, accountable for its genocidal actions and its ethnic cleansing against the Armenians of Artsakh. And you saw during that conference, the summit, there was a bipartisan, bicameral letter initiated, meaning the House and the Senate. So you had White House Senator Cassidy and Jack Reed, along with Congressman Pallone and Bilirakis and Magaziner, putting together a letter calling for sanctions against Azerbaijan, to hold Azerbaijan accountable. That letter was signed by nearly 100 members of Congress and sent to the administration. Then also, at the same time, we honored former Secretary of the Navy, Paul Ignatius, where Speaker Emeriti Pelosi also came, along with Congresswoman Eshoo and Senator Gary Peters from Michigan, who just had come back from Armenia. And after that, Congresswoman Pelosi, Speaker Emerita, and Congresswoman Eshoo spearheaded a letter to the administration calling for sanctions, calling for humanitarian aid to help the Armenian people and to help ensure the safety of the Armenian people. That letter also happened. 75 people signed that letter and sent it. And Senator Gary Peters basically said, enough's enough with waiving Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act, which restricts assistance to Azerbaijan. And he has now introduced a bill to permanently remove that waiver. And that bill is the Armenian Protection Act of 2023. And so that is tangible results of what we do. We just need to do more of it, and that's what we're working on.
That makes sense, but what would you say is the likelihood of that bill actually passing?
Well, the likelihood of that bill passing is going to be up to all of us. So I'm always an optimist, and we're gonna work very hard on it.
Because Armenians have a long memory, right? And there's a prevailing narrative that a lot of powers have all the best intentions, but when we're no longer convenient, we cease to get the help that we need or that we deserve. So essentially, what I'm asking is, how do we make it so that Armenia receives, for lack of a better term, the Israel treatment rather than the Syrian Kurd treatment, right? Is that this is long-term, serious cooperation between the United States and Armenia, and not in the sense that you get something for nothing, but in the very clear understanding that to surrender this region to Russia and China is hurting American interests, is hurting European interests, and it's hurting democracies abroad.
And yet, fair point again in terms of, look, it's in the U.S. national interest to align with democracies. That's their stated policy. And so between Armenia and the United States and obviously the community, there's much more we can do to make that message heard, and much more the U.S. can do. The U.S. needs to step up, and this is the opportunity for the U.S. to step up and show decisive leadership and help Armenia's democracy, help this country in terms of all the adversaries that it faces. And that's an important step.
As far as I've been told from diplomatic circles, is that within the State Department, the perception is that Armenia equals Little Russia, right? Now that's obviously, in large part a failing on our end, right, to tell our story. But now, post-2018, and I would say post, the September 2020, when it's very clear that we're shifting our foreign policy vector, how prevalent is that idea within the United States?
Well, I think, look, I think that's probably a holdover from the Cold War era to a certain extent. And in our meetings with, whether it's members of Congress, the administration, State Department, NSC, we're focused on the US-Armenian relationship, how it can increase, expand, and also making sure that they understand the realities that are here. And that's one of the reasons I'm here along with Anthony Barsamian, our co-chair of the Assembly, and our president, Carolyn Mugar, and our regional director, Arpi Vartanyan. But we're here to really get the current assessment of where things are and ways in which the U.S. can expand the relationship. So that's something we're constantly doing. And I think in terms of understanding the realities, that's something that we help do when we're in Washington, D.C., so they get the full picture.
For decades, the stated reason, at least officially, for the lack of any kind of substantial military aid towards Armenia was our membership in the CSTO and our close relationship with Russia. As I said, right, they perceive us as little Russia. We'll do whatever Moscow tells us to. And if you look at, for example, Kazakhstan, who is a CSTO country and very much within the Russian sphere, they've been receiving to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weaponry. So what would you say is the likelihood of of Armenia, let's say, upgrading its relationship with the United States to one of defense, to receive American tech, to receive American training, to receive defensive weaponry from the United States? And is that an end goal that you guys are working towards?
It's definitely an end goal that we're working towards, absolutely. And I think you saw when Speaker Emerita Pelosi came here, the follow-up was, what more can the United States do to help Armenia's security? Because to have a democracy, you also need security. So having the ability for Armenia to have the defensive equipment, weaponry, et cetera, is something that we continue to push for. And I think you're seeing that cooperation more and more between the United States and Armenia, including the joint exercises that just took place in September, not too long ago, and with more to come.
Okay, well, what would be some of the legal, for example, impediments within the State Department to begin supplying weaponry to Armenia?
Well, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head in terms of the CSTO membership, things like that. So it's going to be a continued challenge and hurdle to overcome. But look, I think the United States should really look at the pivot that Armenia is making and make adjustments in their policies to meet this moment.
There's a common theme amongst a lot of analysts is that Armenia is not particularly important, right? The U.S. has Georgia as a primary partner, although that's debatable in the last few years. That and that there's not much to offer. So why should they care? Why should they protect us? And yet we're seeing regular calls that Armenia's territorial integrity should be protected. It's pretty obvious that it's not within American interests to have a corridor go through southern Armenia that would not just be beneficial to Turkey, Azerbaijan, Russia, but also China. So is this understood within the halls of power in the United States? Is this something that they're seriously considering? And does that explain why there's all of a sudden much more interest here? Now that their Artsakh situation, unfortunately, has been ethnically cleansed, the next step is unique, right?
Right, and it is something that's very much a concern of ours and the entire community, and certainly, as you said, even here. So it's carving up a democracy is not something that would bode well for U.S. in terms of supporting and defending democracies. So you are seeing that strong support behind the scenes for Armenia's territorial integrity and sovereignty.
Currently, we're getting very open support by this administration, although we know that can change, and we know there's an election in the United States next year. Part of the fear over here is that there's going to be a lack of continuity in the foreign policy. What overtures are being done to either side to ensure that no matter what happens and no matter who's sitting in the president's chair, that Armenian interests are always at the forefront?
That's what we focus on. We focus on the issues. So we're a nonpartisan, bipartisan advocacy organization. So whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, and same goes in the Armenian context, whatever political stripes you have, we're focused on the issues and the importance of the issues. So helping expand the U.S.-Armenian relationship about shared values, supporting a democracy. So regardless of who is in charge or who is in power in the United States, the messaging points may vary somewhat depending, but overall the message is the same in terms of helping, a young democracy, a centuries-old Christian nation, help it secure its place and help it against these existential threats that it's facing from its neighbors.
So where would you see the next 5 to 10 years roadmap of your organization?
For our organization,
Yeah.
we would see really expanding our reach. I talked about, when we have our advocacy summits and how other groups have their summits and conferences in DC. I want to see it where there's not just, 500 or 600 people coming, there's 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 people, and not just coming on, every other year. Or, look, as a community, we always come out in terms of commemorating the Armenian genocide, whether it's in LA, in Boston, in Times Square, and it's great. But imagine if everyone that came out to commemorate the Armenian genocide in their local communities also came to Washington, D.C. There'd be such strength in numbers, and that's really what I want to see going forward, is more people engaged and involved and looking at, again, ways that we can continue to help the Armenian people.
Thanks again, Bryan Ardouny. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks.
Thanks again for watching. This has been ՍիվիլՆեթ.